Okay. Okay, we're live and going. So one of the girls this time, who wants to up here? Anybody? See, nobody. Okay, Rebecca. Here's the pen. Rebecca, ladies and gentlemen, who are watching by video, is coming.
Those three
Just, all right, so I just need the source respondent thing, and then in the middle of the message. So 3 circles, as crudely as you can make them.
Wow,
She's very. I knew this was going to happen. Yeah.
Can I
Very
read that, or should I make it bigger?
It's really minute, but go ahead.
Okay.
So you knew that wasn't going to happen when I went up on the board with you.
You got the source, got the respondent, and in the middle is the message, right? Those 3. So what I would like Rebecca to do is to up above the message is to write the word noise. I wish we had a different color.
Oh, are you using the one from the book? Diagram from the book?
Is write the word noise up there. So that's perfect, yeah. And then give us a little feedback loop, just arrow going this way and then back around so that we get the idea, and put the little arrow on it. So we get the idea that somehow the message can be obstructed in some way by the noise. I know we left off encode and decode, but everybody knows that. So what you would like to get, you should enlist the aid of your classmates into listing all different kinds of noise, and then put those inside the box, a little bit smaller print where the message is. Yeah, in there, that'd be fine. Why not? It's all arbitrary anyway. First, to what do we refer when we use the term noise in terms of communication? Is this bothering anybody? This is a great example right here.
A distraction.
Classic.
Yeah, this is classic. True, classic right here. So distraction, but you can take that out because that's not a type of noise. Now, let's list a variety of things and see how creative we can get. David, you start with the first. It's always easier to be the first.
I'll just say a random noise.
Yeah, but don't say the same word.
Bah.
No.
Okay, wait, I'm just supposed to say something that's...
Okay, that's all right. I give you that one, but just put audible noise. That way we distinguish the kind of noise. It's audible. It's something that we hear. So something that we hear could do what to the message? Somebody's trying to convey a message, but the person maybe the message is great, but they're just distracted by, some type of noise. Anything else? What other stuff could distract a person? What other types of noise?
Visual.
We're thinking of what can impair. Yes, you're right. Visual, you can put, let's go with that. So we have auditory stuff, visual stuff. Noise is anything that inhibits the ability of the source to convey the message or the respondent to receive the message. So visual, so we have to know what kind of visual stuff.
Like a visual distraction.
Like writing. Right. So she was writing something, and somebody else was writing another. That'd be distracting.
So if you're outside and you're talking and something comes into your field of vision,
Yeah.
Ping pong ball hitting the paddle.
you'd say,
Yeah, I'd say when we're like trying to learn, and then they all just run out of the classroom.
yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's visual.
Yeah.
And it could be auditory too if they're yelling while they're running by.
It's like that. It's like a gorilla.
What else do we have?
Could it be a visual distraction if you can read her handwriting?
Oh, sure.
Would that be
Yeah, absolutely. If it's written.
We can read it.
Yeah.
If it's in written
If it's
form.
like a- yeah, written
Oh, yeah, that could easily be a form of noise.
Okay.
But let's just use the example of a verbal type of communication. In speech, I should say speech. So what else do we have? You could write one if you think of one also.
Is there environmental?
Yeah, sure. Which really is inclusive of, because obviously a truck backing up, that's part of the environment. What could be some other things relative to environment? Visual is going to be environment as well, but what other things?
Like communication form, it could be like through a TV, or it could
Media.
be like media. 'Cause
Well,
that's
that's just the way that the message is being conveyed. But if it was done poorly,
yeah.
if it was done poorly and you couldn't hear it very well or you couldn't see it very well, yeah, that would be the form of noise. But the environment,
Okay.
what else about environment? So truck backing up, somebody walks by, it's still all part of environment, but what are other factors about environment that could be difficult?
Like olfactory. Sense of smell.
Yeah, it could be. Could be the odor, like odors. You could put that down, odors. I'm thinking more like temperature as well,
Like thermal.
like thermal stuff. Like if it's really, really hot, nobody cares what you're talking about.
Yeah.
If it's really uncomfortable,
Squirrel. Gets me every time.
so you get the idea. Let's think more about the respondent, about the person in general,
Yeah.
and less environment. Let's just now think about the respondent.
Touch.
Reese, yes.
Touch.
In what way?
Well, who's the respondent? Me, right? People?
Just person X.
Person. So, I don't know, touching a book or touching your phone.
What does that do?
Um,
But it could be, if you're thinking in terms of somebody's body, we think of somebody's like temperature, you're hot, you're cold, but also if you're in pain.
I was about to say health.
Yeah, if you're hungry. Yeah, if you've got a migraine, if there's something is bothering you, yeah, if you gotta go, and any of those things, right? So you get the idea that it's fairly complex, just getting what you have to say over there to somebody, and then wondering why you had a certain amount of miscommunication. So I mentioned I had a board meeting. I don't know if I need this on the video, but I had a board meeting on Friday, right? It was like 4 hours of talking. And so it's in Zoom, and so you've got the chat room, and just a minute, I'm getting ready to give a report. I didn't get 30 seconds into the report, and all of a sudden all these questions. It had nothing to do with what I'm saying. It's just, first you want to hear the person, right? Listen to what they have to say, because your questions might be answered by the time they're done, Instead, people, I know right off the bat, they're not listening. They're not going to listen to what I say. They're just going to start, listing questions. That can be a distraction. Somebody's pre-understanding about. So if we go away from the physiological stuff, what your body is feeling, to the cognitive stuff, can be, and we'll talk about it, in the next unit with this idea of worldviews. So if you're talking with someone whose pre-understanding of reality, pre-understanding of the world around them, is quite different from yours. Maybe it's somebody who's Islamic, or one of the Chinese religions, or a Hindu, or anything like that, or just atheistic. They're sort of blocking out certain things that you're saying because they have this stigma, or they have this blind spot, that obscures everything, or obfuscates everything, for a nice college word. Okay, perfect, nice job. Thank you very much, everybody. Give her something for that. That's really terrific. All right, so let's jump in here to communication and culture, the role of communication and culture, all still very elemental things, very basic things. Cultural barrier to missionary communication. So you say, well, I'm not going to be a missionary and all that. And we talked about what that word means and things. But the book, he's just going to mention this because it's a manual for training missionaries in essence. But for our purposes, we're not necessarily thinking that you're going to be launched into some career missionary enterprise in a foreign context. But it still can help us to understand key elements of communication, especially with people in our demographic up here in the Northeast, or whenever you go home and find yourself planted in a place that has a lot of non-Christian element, and by non-Christian can mean a whole range of beliefs and belief systems. So you think of that a little bit as cross-cultural. So cultural barriers are unlike physical barriers in geographic boundaries. So this is an abstract concept, obviously, when we say cultural barriers. Barriers is rather figurative, but they may be thought of as chasms. Well, you know what a chasm is, right? So, this deep chasm. And so if you're over here, and someone else is over here, you've got to think of ways to bridge that chasm. And there's a whole bunch of chasms. So I've taught comparative religion at SUNY for like the last 15 years, and makes for a lot of interesting conversations. But Diana Eck, she's a professor of comparative religions at Harvard University. And I've used a number of her things, not because what she has to say aligns with what I believe, but she would be a textbook example of somebody who holds to the concept of religious pluralism. There's religious diversity that says you're all diverse, you're all distinct, you're all different, and so all these religions are different. Religious diversity is an observation, but religious pluralism is more a conviction. And it's a conviction that although there's religious diversity, all of those religions contain some element of truth, and there is no hierarchy of truth where this one is totally true and the rest are totally false, but they all sit at a round table and all have an equal position at the rest. So you can see where that particular view would go. But she does make some great points in terms of this idea of chasms. And so she would point out chasms, especially technological types of chasms. And if you think today, just these smartphones, one statistic that is not really that old, but is shocking, 65% of the world's population has never made a phone call. 65% of the world's population. I mean, just imagine, I was in Jamaica a few years ago, and these kids, we were doing a bunch of, I was working with some churches, but then I was also training some pastors, but then there was a bunch of kids stuff going on that I was attending all these kids. It was remarkable. I'd sit in the back and kind of watch. They all had 3 cell phones. Not smartphones, but just 3, like flip phones. Well, they weren't even flip phones, the old kind. 3 cell phones. And I thought, what? And that's because of the cell service on the island. It's a small island, but it had the minute you went from one place to the other, you had to put this phone away, use this phone. I had a phone, and I had 1,000 minutes on it for like $10. That's how cheap it was. I was calling my wife for like an hour at a clip, just trying to run the time down, But there's chasms in terms of, you think of that type of population, even a remote kind of third worldish area, or majority world, they call it now, like Jamaica or some parts of Africa, but then places where that technology is foreign to them. So things that we assume are givens in terms of our culture. So the word, is kind of culture right now. We want to deal with culture and then worldview. But culture, what is culture? And how is it affected us growing up and even intergenerationally, right? So, I was born in 1960, so everything was black and white then, TV, everything, monochrome. Now everything is all high tech and it's different. So even intergenerationally, the culture can be slightly different, but still it's basic American culture, basic American values. But how do you deal with that? How do you deal with these chasms? How do you cross them? It can be religious chasms, can be technological chasms, can be economic chasms. A person who's perceived of, like, if you're an American, it doesn't matter how poor you might be, any place else in the world, for the majority outside of the Western world, the United States and Europe, you're wealthy. Just doesn't matter. You're an American, you're automatically wealthy. That's what everybody perceives through the media. So how do you bridge those gaps between your affluence, your relative affluence, and their abject poverty in many cases? So I won't overplay that. So the technology chasm, for example, what did I write here? 1995, in a survey of telecommunications by The Economist magazine, the phrase "half of the world's population has never made a phone call," where I mentioned that. So the world has gotten smaller, and yet we still are faced with chasms. Think of the United States, where you have Black Lives Matter, right? So you have that kind of a movement, but regardless of the opinion and perception, what does it say about culture? It says that there's a chasm there. There's a chasm. There's a deep chasm. It's been there as long as I've been alive, and I can remember during the 60s, although young, just seeing riots and assassinations, presidents assassinated, attorney generals assassinated, key religious civil rights leaders assassinated, all this. It was a violent era. And all because of these chasms. So what am I pointing out? Well, there's a racial chasm then. Racial, point X is one race, point Y is a different race. How are you going to bridge that? And I'm just saying those types of things. We could talk about noise, but if we changed it to chasms, how does a person of X culture talk to a person of Y? Then we change this noise to something altogether different. So multiple rhetorics, this is a term that is used in the book in intercultural communication. It uses the diplomat analogy, or an envoy should not presume that people in other cultures will be persuaded in the same manner as his native country. And by rhetoric, it just means that. Sometimes a speaker will say, well, I have a question, but I'm just being rhetorical, and that means I just want you to think about it. I don't want you to answer. But to use the term properly, rhetoric, then we're saying there's a particular style in which I speak or communicate with the intention of to try to persuade you to my point of view. There's nothing nefarious about that. That's just the point of communication. If anything, source X, respondent Y, the message is intended at least to be understood. I want to persuade you to be understood, but to be persuasive in some way. What do you have to do to be persuasive? Now I could give a script and have everyone just read the script. It might be the Gettysburg Address, for example. And someone could read it in a very monotone, almost half-asleep mode. It's the same information. And you're hearing it and you're understanding it, but where's the rhetorical side of it? There's no change in the intonation of your voice. There's no stress on certain parts of it. There's no passion in it. There's no emphasis in it. To understand rhetoric, I think, is an important thing. So one needs to know, for example, the ideological framework, the system of ideas and ideals of the respondent's culture is how they formulate their ideas rather than determine what they think. The idea of ideological framework, what is kind of the grid by which they process information, how they think, not just what they think. I think this is important. So the book cites the example of Buddhist Sri Lanka. If anybody's been in contact with Naomi, for example, she's from Sri Lanka. She's phenomenal. I mean, she'd be your best friend. She's an absolutely phenomenal person. quite a testimony. Father's a pastor in Sri Lanka, came to probably the States about 17 years ago, to study at Davis, and then she stayed on. She's like my right arm in a lot of ways, does a tremendous job. But in Buddhist Sri Lanka, neutrality in decision making is preferred over the American, kind of mentality. You got to decide. Make up your mind. It's kind of sales approach. So we're big on making decisions, decision making, and then the consequences that come from decisions. But for the Buddhists, neutrality is considered to be a virtue. Rushing to a decision, then, is not really considered to be virtuous, more so just standing in a neutral position. Why? Because the Buddhist values harmony, right? If you make a decision, it's like, well, I'm taking this side over this side, and I'm putting everything in disharmony, rather to be in a position where everything is in harmony. So that's an interesting chasm to try to cross, especially if you're used to being in the States and you're preaching a message, or you're giving the gospel, and you're calling your hearers, your listeners, to make a decision, and they're just listening to you, smiling, and you say, well, don't you understand what I'm saying? You've got to decide, and you've got to decide right now. And they're thinking, I don't think so. But that's associated with culture. They're not being obstinate. It's just a cultural thing, and you have to basically formulate your approach given their ideological mindset. How they process things. So understanding culture, let's go there. Defining culture then, the term culture broadly includes the distinctive features which identify population groups, example, linguistic groups, language, all kinds of languages, political, socialist, communist, democracy, economic, various free market, or even socialism is its own. Socialism, communism, free market, capitalism. These are all have to do with who owns the stuff that you produce things with, and then who gets the money after you sell it. This is basic difference between how these economic systems work. But you'd have to understand, one's language, politics, economic, social, psychological, religious, national, racial. For example, national. I'll say in Poland. One of the observations that I remember years ago, one of my Polish friends telling me, he never could understand this. He'd say, why in your churches do you have American flags, on your, and it used to be back in those days, you'd have like the American flag over here and the Christian flag over here. I don't know if you had those in school or I don't know. But it used to be, and they'd think, why is that in the church? Why is that in the worship center? For an American, they'd say, well, we understand, God's given us human government, and we understand our responsibility to pray and our allegiance to the government and civil authority. But we're also nationalistic, and patriotic and things of that nature. But again, it was a cultural kind of like, what's that all about? Does that really belong there? So culture is a way of thinking, feeling, believing. It's a group's cumulative knowledge stored up for future use. Now that sounds all abstract and weird and hard to understand, but I think it's a good definition, and I don't expect everybody to sort of grab that, but if you think of it as cumulative knowledge, and so the fact of whenever you were born into this culture and whenever I was born into this culture, there's a certain cumulative knowledge about that. Now, I realize a lot of American culture is regional, just slightly different. I've lived in different parts of the United States. But in essence, Americans are quite similar in things that they value, things that they stand for. One being like the rule of law, fairness, justness, and that's where things get skewed. When you have some violent type of event, that is so unjust and we'd say egregious, something like that. It strikes against the heart of who we are as a people, a law-abiding people, a nation of laws, and things of this nature. But it is the cumulative knowledge. It is something that we don't reinvent every generation. We don't reinvent it every year or every 10 years. So culture is a design for living. It's a plan according to which society adapts itself to its physical, social, ideational environment. A plan for coping with a physical environment, which would include such matters as food production and all technological knowledge and skill, political systems, kinships, family organization, law are examples of social adaptation. A plan according to which one is to interact with his fellows. Man copes with his ideational environment through knowledge, art, magic, science, philosophy, religion, all these kinds of things. So this is just culture in general, not one specific culture in particular, but how human societies function, and they function in terms of what they believe, what they don't believe, their values, what they consider to be virtuous kind of behavior, and what they consider to be vicious kind of behavior. You know, vicious is malevolent. It's intended to do harm. Virtue is good. It's intended to benefit, and all those kinds of things. And different societies have different answers to those questions. You might look at a particular society and say, that seems brutal, absolutely brutal, but yet they interpret it as being civil. And you're thinking, I don't get that. I don't understand that. And there's some very bizarre, through our eyes, some very bizarre practices. But that's culture. It's kind of an all-inclusive, and it goes hand in hand with worldview. But it's like an all-inclusive mindset that you possess by which you interpret what's being said to you. You interpret what you see. For example, through the media. Just seeing what goes on around the world, you interpret that according to your own culture, and I don't know what types of value assignments you make. You know, when you hear something and see something, are you hearing it and seeing it in terms of that's good, that's not good, that's sinful, that's appropriate? And where do those distinctions come from? How are those embedded in us? And to a large degree, culture. So there's this nurture-nature, which you can talk about in psychology, nurture and nature in terms of development. Are you an environmentalist? Not in terms of save the flowers, but are you an environmentalist, meaning that your character is influenced largely by things outside of you, some persons in your life, or things that have happened to you? Or are you a behaviorist on the other side in terms of it's more internal than external? Nurture versus nature. It's how you were nurtured, how you were raised in a certain sense to appreciate certain values, and because of those values you're able to confront the world around you. So characteristics of culture is learned and not biologically determined or racially restricted. You weren't born with a predisposition for your culture. And neither were the people in another culture born with that predisposition to that culture. So there wasn't predetermined within them. And it isn't necessarily racial. Because you're of that race, it must be that you're of this particular culture. So culture is a shared system by those who make up that society. Culture is the American society is a bit different because it seems like we have every culture in the world here. And so depending on where you go, it's always called a melting pot type of culture, just because someone from another culture emigrates to the United States. Now they brought that culture with them, but they emigrate, you might say migrate, but they emigrate here, and then they integrate. Emigrate to get here, then they integrate. And people that will tell you, well, I came to the United States as a teenager, and I've been here for 20 years, and so on. And there's still a bit of a vestige of their own culture. And I really don't, well, I do know a little bit, haven't lived in Europe, but I know what it's like to maybe be of one culture and then be at a new host culture. And it is it's an altogether different kind of feeling than if you've just been born and raised in the same culture. So it's an integrated whole. Each part relates to the others, and all the parts contribute to the whole, which is a beautiful thing, that we can appreciate some of the good things that other cultures bring, and especially so in a community. And I can remember after 9/11 being asked to help over at SUNY, to help with some interfaith type of communication, between. And at the very least, everything was certainly on edge, for a while. And the tendency would be just to see somebody of a different race and see them as a threat. And so to be able to come together in a community, not to just say, well, we just accept everybody's beliefs, or so. That's not what the interfaith was about. But it was to say, let's communicate. If we're communicating, then we're understanding. And we're at least developing some common appreciation for all those that are sharing our streets and our homes and our schools and things of this nature. Culture constantly changes due to innovations, internal pressures, and cultural borrowing. If you just look back, 100 years, and you'll see like even pre-industrial times, how our culture was more agrarian. Agriculture and a bunch of little farms everywhere, and more rural. And then things began to become more industrial. And with that, people left the farms and they had to go where there was work. And so there was, this movement, urbanization, where the cities began to become more and more populated. So now we have these mega cities in the world, cities of 20 million and projected, some of upwards of 50 million. Can you imagine? Think of the social, economic issues in a city that size. Think about that. Is what happens. This is how our world is changing, and it's how our culture changes. Think of Europe for just a second, and some of the migrants. It's the greatest population shift since World War II, and you have folks that are bringing their cultures and values and all these things into Germany by the hundreds of thousands, into Poland by the millions, and you're seeing the landscape, the borders are still discrete, the national borders, but the makeup of those societies and populations are vastly changing. And so it's not uncommon if you are in Germany or Austria or Hungary or any one of these places to run into a whole population. So I pastored on 85th Street in Brooklyn back in the 80s, 1980s. So anyway, I was near the Verrazzano Narrows church there, and it was predominantly an Italian neighborhood, and so it was predominantly Catholic. And here I am pastoring this evangelical church there. So who moved into the area but about 50,000 Russians? 50,000 Russians with the Italians. I'm thinking, I wonder how this is going to work. Suddenly, I'm noticing my congregation is changing. I mean, I think I counted like 9 different ethno-linguistic groups at one time out there. It was this international congregation. Now think about it. Our children were young at the time. I remember they were entering the public school, so we took them to the clinic to get their, all these shots that they had, the vaccines and whatnot. And we were the only English-speaking people. There was just all of the Russians were trying to do the same thing, and they didn't have any papers with them. No one was speaking English, and the nurse was just screaming, learn English, learn English. She was getting all frustrated. But see, now there's this sort of blending, and this is what it is about cross-cultural borrowing. And you find this to be another facet of culture, and to what types of pressures change a culture. I was going to just pop this in. I don't know if it'll work.
Opens up a whole can of very, very interesting issues. Let's try and pick a couple of them. But before I do, it's evident to me, and I'm enormously encouraged by this.
Oh, I have no picture. That's
passionate
bad.
Australian. I want this country to be the sort of place that offers opportunities of the sort that I had when I was young. You know, I've had my opportunities, but I look at my kids' generation. What's going to be there for them if we keep feeding them this sort of
Just one word I want you to get out of this.
In reality, the people turning out in vast numbers, every one of your talks in Australia has been oversubscribed massively. It tells you they kind of get that there's more to this
They
than
know.
they're being told.
Oh yeah, they know. Well, it's one of the things that's so interesting about dealing with archetypal themes. Archetypal themes are archetypal because they actually speak of the structure of human experience. That's why they last. And so human nature and human experience has a pattern. You don't have the capacity to articulate that pattern.
I just wanted you to get that word archetypal or archetypal themes. And so what he goes on to talk about is this notion that people believe and think a certain way simply because their culture, they've lived in that culture and been influenced by that culture. So you sort of have a microcosm of that if you're raised in a family unit that has its own culture, right? Your parents had certain values and they established certain boundaries, right? So the rules made no sense. You're growing up and you're saying, I don't get this, but here are all these rules. And the rules were simply boundaries for you to learn certain values of theirs, right? And so you come away from that in another 10 years and another 20 years, you're going to be mirroring your parents, whatever they said, and it's going to come without thinking. And it's because those values became second nature to you. Now, as a society, there are certain things that are, I'll use the word endemic to that society, or these archetypal things. Basically, it's the accumulated values that are transferred from one generation to the other, to the other, to the other. Now, just as those things develop, they can change. They can change. So I was teaching ethics, taught ethics and philosophy at SUNY as well. And I remember having a class about 40, 50 students and asked them a simple question about ethics. Do you think our culture here in the United States do you think we're better off morally or worse morally than, let's say, your parents' generation or 40, 50 years ago? Do you think better or worse? And I would have thought that they would have said, oh, so much better, because when you look at the media and you listen to the progressives, because that's what progressive means, right? We're making progress, social progressives, whether it's same-sex marriage and any number of these things, right? See the progress that we're making. We're getting better and better and better and better. And to the person in that room, they said, no, we're horrible. We're more degenerate now than we've ever been. And I thought, wow, that's an amazing insight. So then I flipped it on them and I said, well, so that implies that there is a standard, because what I did was I just asked you a question that implies, a certain standard. In other words, we were here and that was okay, and now we're here and that's better, or we're here and that's worse. And ultimately the question was, where did that standard come from? Who gave you that standard? Is it just, cultural thing? So archetypal stuff, it's just for the sake of using the word. So it makes us all elite and all that. Categories or types of culture. So technological culture, artifacts and activities to manipulate the material world. That sounds all sophisticated, but you get it, right? When you look in a particular culture, ours is highly Japanese, Chinese. So we don't get we can't buy the Chinese stuff here just because everything they make, well, I shouldn't say this, but the perception is everything they make is intended to spy on us or something, like they've embedded something. But they're, elsewhere. Like if I'm in Europe, you know, those stores are all over they have their version of the Apple stuff, and it's cheaper and it's got more stuff on it. My thing was always, you know, to buy one and use it here. But nonetheless, there are those cultures that are very, very technological, which we are. How much of the technology impacts your values? How much of your technology impacts your view of reality? I mean, when you think about it, the fact that you can do things so quickly, you can get information, you know, right here, these amazing devices, right? There it is, boom, 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 got everything. My whole life on this thing, just OneDrive, how many terabytes of stuff I have of just data on here, or notes, or the ability on the fly to access. I mean, these are the coolest things, right? So if I drop down somewhere, I switch a SIM card, and I've got my navigation, I can go anywhere. Provided this one key factor, and that is that you activate the SIM card. So, you know, I remember taking a trip one time, and I had it all planned out. I'm going to fly into this airport, and I said, I'm going to take this bus to the central train station. Then, you know, it's typical European stuff, right? Then at the central train station, it's late at night, I'm going to make my way over to this place where I'd arranged to stay, you know, get a room there. No problem. But I'd never been in that particular, I've been in that country many times, but not in that particular place, this particular route. And I'm getting in, it's about midnight, 1 a.m., and I'm thinking, I'm all set, got my SIM card in, can just pop in the address of Ulica, you know, whatever street it is, and head over there, and I have no service.
Oh, no.
I think I'm right in the heart of it's Wi-Fi everywhere. Where's my service? I forgot to activate it.
No.
Well, so then I had to, well, no, it's never, it just is like, and it's freezing cold, by the way. The wind's blowing, it's dead of winter. So I figured it's nightlife, there's all kinds of people out there. So I just start going, I start asking people, you know, so, hey, Gdzieje, Ulica, whatever, you know, it's fine. And the Polish people, they're so nice. You know, I came up on a young couple, they're probably out for a date that night and just coming from some restaurant. And so I approached them at some dark alley, which I favor the dark alleys anyway. That's how I fly. So I'm in this dark alley, and here they come, and I asked them, and they said, just in case they won't leave you. So they said, we will take you. Come on, we will take you. And they walked me all around this place. It's really good. But it's the technology stuff, technology, right? And that impacts how we think. Obviously, it did me. You know, I made all these assumptions. You know, I can this, and this. Sociological culture, patterns of relationships and behaviors. Now, your former Soviet bloc, which you'd read out in a history book, but I have been there back when it was that, behind the Iron Curtain. That's this culture, sociological. And so it might be communistic, but that's the government, not the people. That's the government. So that meant that the people valued relationships more than they did stuff. You know, if you've ever been in that kind of culture, which is awesome. And if you want to offend them, just don't go in when they invite you in for tea or, I mean, that's everything. Don't tell them, yeah, I already had some or something like, you know, hey, they want to interact. They want to build those relationships. Now what I've seen in some of those cultures, the more that the American companies or European companies have brought in their fast food restaurants and all their shopping malls. Oh my word, these things are massive. Now it's become so impersonal. And I'm the old guy in the room, and I'm trying to tell the young people, I mean, I knew their parents when their parents were their age, and trying to just tell them how things are changing. You know, but it's amazing now that far more technological. Somehow we think we're going to change the world, make it better because they have more technology. I don't know if we've helped or not. But it's hard to do that without losing the social side, right? So what's the condemnation of social media? What's the main condemnation? Well, outside of what you're writing in it, but what's the main condemnation? Isn't it that I mean, I listen to my mother. I still have one parent living. You know, my mother, she's in Texas. And her thing is, well, people, they don't talk to each other anymore. Well, they do. They just do it differently. You know, communication is different. But the fact that there's less person-to-person kind of interaction, that's the perception. I don't know if it's the reality, but it's the perception. Ideological cultures include knowledge, values, worldviews, values of a people. Some cultures, even Indian, let's say India, so I've been there several times. So India, I would say, would be all three of these. You just do a little travel, and I can be in Hyderabad with 11 million people, be in the slums of Hyderabad preaching to people, and then be with these high caste Hindus over here wanting to talk the Upanishads and all this philosophical stuff. And then you can switch gears, go down near Bangalore, and you have completely illiterate people that think you're a shaman, that honestly, they think you're a holy man, and they want you to come and to bless them and their family and all these things, right? So it's a hodgepodge of all of these things, but that's culture. So I think the idea of dimensions is a good one. You have Erin Meyer's book, and she talks about culture in terms of scales. She rates it in different scales. There's the word dimension, but however you consider it. In the book, you have this layers of culture. What is buried most deeply in this cultural model? And you'll see, okay, if this is the center point, you know, that's what's buried here is the ideology, or cosmology is just a term for the origins of things. You know, where did the world come from, and all these cosmological types of observations and myths, stuff like that about the origins of the universe, but one's worldview. Ideology is like a very fixed framework of thinking. We'd call it like a mindset. And you filter all your information through that mindset. The essential thinking of which one drives one's conception of the world is ideological. So is Christianity an ideology? You know, does it fall into that category? And for someone who is a disciple of Jesus, and someone, an ardent disciple of Jesus, a serious follower of Jesus, to many, we are ideologues. You know, we're ideologically bound, and it's almost a bad word to some, because they say almost like you're a fanatic. You would do anything in the name of that cause, or you would suffer anything in the name of that cause. But I would invite you to take a little softer view of this term ideology. It's just meaning yes, we're going to think within a biblical framework. I mean, that's why we're here, but we're going to think biblically about things. You know, what does the Bible have to say about, you know, whatever the latest thing is going on in the world, the latest political views, the latest ethical kind of consideration that comes out, stem cell research, you know, and in vitro fertilization, or all these types of things, and we'd say, wow. Where does that fit within our biblical way of thinking? Other aspects of culture stem from and are layered upon these basic beliefs. So everything kind of, if you think of it this way, let's, instead of ideology, say your biblically based, biblically informed way of determining what's virtuous, what's vicious, what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, what's just, what's unjust. All those decisions, those value assignments we make to certain beliefs and practices and stuff like that. So that then is going to further, you know, affect what we say our values. You know, think about why do we value life? Why do we have issues when it comes to abortion and that whole subject? You know, why do we have strong emotions about protecting that fetus in the womb? You know, why? And it's all going to come back to the value of life that God has placed. God has placed that value. We recognize that biblically, hence we adopt that value. And then from those values, we might say those right and wrong things come what? The institutions. Why marriage? What constitutes marriage? What is marriage? So on. And laws. The laws that are created. So we are a nation of laws, but ultimately those laws are based on Judeo-Christian ethics, so-called, right? It's going to come from biblical, again, stemming from biblical things and other things, material artifacts or observable behavior things that you see. So that's all layers of culture. And in the culture map, then, this is what Erin Meyer does. Of course, because she's secular doesn't mean she's inherently wrong. You know, it's just who she is, right? But she trains business people according to these scales. And in her book, then she dedicates a certain portion of the book to each one of these scales and then gives little anecdotes of actual her life experience of, well, I can remember a good example, and a lot of her bad examples are her own personal examples, where she just says, wow, I didn't do well. I was just starting out, and I had a business meeting with some person, I don't know if it was German or something like that, and I made a mistake. Well, anyway, here are all of these scales, and then she's going to use like Germany, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam to almost like a continuum that spans the two, I want to say antipodes, but in a continuum, you have a line and then two polarities, two poles, and they are opposite. So a continuum, like low context, high context for a second. We'll see that video in a second. Low context, high context, in terms of communicating, and as if there are variant forms of that in between. And then in evaluating things, does a society prefer direct negative feedback? Do you really want to be told to your face? Is that what we want? Do we want that right there, right up front? Direct negative feedback or indirect? Are there indirect ways? And so you see how the different societies are rated and how that works out a little bit. So there's a long kind of list of that. Let's see if we can get her just to do.
In a low context society.
I know, sorry about that, but there you are.
While we are communicating, we assume that we have a low level of shared context. What does that mean? It means that we don't have the same reference points or the same body of knowledge or relationships, that we have a low level of shared context. So in a low context society, we believe that good, effective, professional communication is a communication that's very explicit. That's very simple and very clear. In a low context society, we're trained that if I want you to understand blue, then I have to say blue, literally. We're trained in a low context culture that if I give a presentation, I should tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I should tell you, and then I should tell you what I told you. Why do I tell you the same thing 3 times? Because we're focused overall on making sure that the message was...
So listen as she described it, this is Americans. This is textbook American. We probably lead the world in being a low context culture, which means with any type of communication, we're looking for that information that we need, and we have every expectation that we're going to get it. Not left sort of like, what? Or what do I have to infer from that? Much of Europe is this way.
Simply and clearly. In a high context society, while we're communicating, we assume or consider that we have a larger body of shared context. that we have the same reference points, body of knowledge, information, and because we assume all of this shared context, in a high-context society, we believe good, effective communication is a communication that's more implicit, or layered, or nuanced. I had a German individual who said to me, you know, Erin, in Germany, at the end of a meeting, we almost always do a recap. First we do a verbal recap, and then we do a written recap.
Germany.
That's low context, right? Clarification, clarification, clarification. He said, now that I've been working frequently with the French, I often find that at the end of a meeting, I'll get ready to do a recap, and my French colleagues will just stand up, and someone will say, et voila, there it is. And I'll think to myself, but voila, what? And then I'll be very surprised to see that it just seems that people know what's been decided, that they know what's supposed to happen next, without going through all of those levels of clarification.
Yeah, and so you get that difference between high con. Now that's not a small thing. That's actually a pretty huge thing. Depending, and if you don't know that, and you're just going blind into a culture, and that's been me a lot of times. You're in a room, and all of a sudden, everybody just gets up, and they're going, and you're like, "Where's everybody?" And the American wants information. They want to know very specifically what time. For example, when I was speaking in Germany, right? So we're getting ready for the service, the worship service, and I'm in this room, and it's a large kind of conference room, and everybody that had a part in that service was in that room. And there's a schedule, you know, like this order of service. But unlike any you've ever seen, it had right to the minute and second. It said like so-and-so this, 1 minute, 12 seconds, so-and-so this. And I thought, wow, whoever's done this is OCD, you know, this is incredible. But that's how it was, very, very, there was no doubt. And you walked out with absolutely no doubt as to what you were doing and how long you had to do it. It was that specific. So going then, you know, cross down this way, down into Romania. So I'm, you know, let's see, down past Bucharest and to, Galați, Romania. And so here's a church, a rural church, the same situation, but there's no meeting before. And I get up on the platform because I'm the American, right? I'm the American. I got to know how long. How long do I have? Because everything's on a schedule. And I said, Stuart, how long? And he's looking at his clock and he does this with his watch and he goes, this. And he's like, you know, 2.5 hours or something like that. Just the difference. But even that will affect communication. In Kenya, for example, we were doing 75, so I taught like, first time there, I taught like 40 pastors for 1 week. Here's a course, so many hours a day, so on. 2 weeks after that, we went every day 5 churches, and we were trying to get in like 75 churches because everybody says, come here, come there. We're just bouncing all over the place in rainy season, muddy roads, all this stuff. And I was aware of what the schedule was for the day where we had to go. But the fellow that was driving, he was sort of like the guy who was in charge of, took care of all these churches, all these pastors. And so I just trusted him. He's going to get us there, and he knows the schedule. But you know, you're driving, and all of a sudden he stops in this village and is talking for 45 minutes, you know, out the car window with this person, and he's over here. And I'm thinking, aren't those people waiting for us? You know, aren't they waiting for us somewhere? And you get there, and they've been waiting for like 8 hours. And they're not angry. They're perfectly fine. And it's just the difference in the culture. Because in that culture, in Africa time especially, in that particular culture, if there is no on time, not on time. There's like flex time, you know, and it's the idea that if you were delayed and didn't make it, there could have been 1,000 reasons, but the biggest reason is that you were talking with someone. See, they just valued these personal relationships where me, I would just, you know, kind of drive by. We would just drive by. Well, got to get there. Hey, got to get there. Got an appointment. Just like you're walking across campus and you say, oh, you know, I'd like to chat, but hey, got to get there. Got to get there. I'm late for this or assignment or something, right? And in other cultures, it's more, no, you'll stop if we mimic that here on campus, it'd be you stopping, talking with that person. If they had a problem, spending time with them, so you missed your service assignment, and all of a sudden that was okay. It's probably not going to work out, though, here, is it? No. So I'm just saying, that'd be like in some cultures, that'd be okay. But here, we're low context. That's who we are. So it's just a point, for us to understand that. Other observations about culture, then culture blindness. She mentions this. Wow, I didn't bring did anybody bring the book by any chance? Because I don't think I have it here. It's 25, and I meant to grab it, but I didn't. But anyway, this sense of culture blindness, where we're impaired in our ability to understand these things. Acultural would be a term not determined by or relating to any specific culture. This does not apply to persons. We all have been impacted by culture. So it could be something in a particular culture that's acultural. Like a building or an object or something. Acculturated would, having been enculturated in our native culture, we become at home in our new host culture. So let's say you're born and raised in the United States, the northeastern United States, but your whole life there, and now you're off to the Philippines. And there you go. And it's not for 2 weeks, because that wouldn't be enough time to become acculturated, right? So you've been enculturated. You are a native, a creature of you don't even have to think. It's who you are. But now you come into a different culture, and there's all that pain, of culture shock, all that pain that's like, they're high context, I'm low context, I just can't get it. I feel lost here. I feel, just completely ostracized, living in the margins. I don't get their concept of time. And their whole value system, I don't understand it. And you fight it and fight it and fight it because you're trying to impose your own culture on that one, which will never work, right? So you gradually adopt that particular culture to the point where you become acculturated. In other words, you're perfectly comfortable. You're perfectly comfortable in your home culture. When we lived out of the country for some time, coming back to the United States was like a shock. That wasn't as big of a shock, but I just noticed all the changes, that had taken place. So, acculturated is a good word. Bicultural, the persons who are enculturated into cultures, basically. It's really a rarity. It's not just that you feel comfortable in both, but sometimes children can be that way if they were raised in one culture, for several years, and then went to a different culture. Supracultural, anything that has its source outside of any particular culture, understanding here that culture requires human existence and is a human phenomenon, yet there are forces. So what he's talking about here gets a little abstract, right? Supracultural, which means, okay, you get the culture. Culture is relative to human behaviors and thoughts and ideas, not stuff, but just how people behave, how people think, what they value. But what else is going on? And I think Christians, we can appreciate this because we could say, yeah, it's not just us. It's just not just us in the world. And you think of, and in some cultures, they're thinking in terms of spiritual entities. I mean, look in the Indian, just drop in India anywhere, and you're going to see all the iconography of whatever their religions are. If you're riding in one of those see the little yellow, they look like bumper car things, and I've ridden in those, and you just close your eyes and hold your breath. But inside, there's all these little pictures of the, goddesses or the different gods, and it's just replete. It's everywhere. So they're basically going to see a lot of natural phenomena, stuff that happens in terms of spiritual causation. Okay, so that was an explosion. That was a sickness. Well, we don't need the biological explanation of that. We know there was some spiritual, especially the more animistic the culture, they're going to see these types of things rooted in nature itself, and shamans that can somehow manipulate the unseen world. And we as Christians perfectly understand spiritual warfare, and we know that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, the rulers of the darkness of this age, spiritual wickedness in high places, Paul says in Ephesians 6:10. So we recognize, but we don't necessarily attribute. I remember praying with a charismatic friend of mine, and we were outside and sitting at a picnic table, and this was right before like a week of youth camp or something, and we were there to take part in it. And the wind began to blow, and she took that as being all the angels of God, coming in to help through that. But that was her understanding of it. Hey, yeah, right. But it's in that same principle where you associate certain phenomena with unseen forces and things of that nature. Sometimes wind is just wind, but you get that. So let's leave it here for today. Let me.